This episode of The Edge is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek.fm at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
You're listening to Trek FM.
What have you done out there on the edge of Federation space?
Welcome, everyone, to Notes from the Edge, a sub-show of our Star Trek Discovery podcast, The Edge. I'm C Bryan Jones, or Chris, and I'll be your host as we flip through the pages of our notebook. In Notes from the Edge, we'll explore connections between Discovery and the greater Star Trek universe, which includes the prior 6 TV series and 13 films, as well as the massive literary universe, because there are elements from there that are being worked into the series. And we'll also delve deeper into some of the ideas that are unique to Discovery. I kick off each episode of Notes with my thoughts on the latest episode of Discovery, which this time means the butcher's knife cares not for the lamb's cry. My thoughts will be a bit longer this time than usual, and I'm going to touch on 4 main points: characters, Klingon dialogue, a couple of small connections, and the Tardigrade, which is the focus of the Notes section. Okay, so first this week, I'll touch on the characters. In the last episode of Notes, I was a bit critical of Landry and Tilly. I was not ready to form an opinion about Stamets, and I said that I really like Lorca and Saru. I still have the same feelings about Lorca and Saru, and Doug Jones in particular, I think is doing a fantastic job with his character. I do still see Sheldon Cooper in Saru, which is not a bad thing. It's kind of fun, but the character is growing, even in the limited scenes that he is getting, and Jones is conveying so much emotion through that heavy makeup. I think it's really good work. I am really liking Saru. I got a better feel for Stamets this time, and since he wasn't having to explain the concept of spore drive to everybody, I found him to be more approachable and more real. I liked the way he was willing to listen to Burnham's hypothesis. At first, he wasn't so sure. He was a little bit on guard, but then he opened up, and I liked how his demeanor changed when he realized that she was right, and also his amazement when he saw the star chart showing that the tardigrade was holding the coordinates for all mapped star systems in its head. You could see that he really is a scientist and is in Starfleet to be an explorer. It creates a very interesting contrast on this ship that is a science vessel, although in context is for kings when Burnham mentioned to Saru, so this is a science vessel. Saru just went kind of, because there's this tug-of-war between the war effort with Lorca and the science effort with Stamets. And it's a nice contrast, and I liked what I saw in this episode. Anthony Rapp felt more at ease in the role. For me, that's how I took it, and that's a great thing. I really liked what I saw him doing in this episode, and I'm looking forward to seeing Stamets continue to grow. Tilly, however, isn't growing on me as much, but I did like her better this time around than last. I have to see her do something more than just be comic contrast to Burnham. I will say that I think Mary Wiseman did a good job with portraying Tilly in this episode, so this isn't about the actress. And also, I think her mom should leave her alone about her hair. Come on, Mom, let her do what she wants with her hair. But back to the character as she is on the show, these occasional appearances by the insecure, neurotic roommate aren't really what I expect from a Starfleet cadet. So props to Wiseman, but I'm still waiting to see how Tilly fits into the story beyond showing up from time to time to nudge Burnham forward. Yeah, there's some value in having that character there for Burnham, but I don't know. Tilly's still rubbing me the wrong way a bit. We lost a character in this episode, Landry, and I'm glad to see her go. It has nothing to do with Rekha Sharma, who I like, but the writers didn't give Rekha much to work with. Landry was a poorly written one-note character who appears to have been there from the moment the prison shuttle landed aboard Discovery, just for the purpose of this death scene in the butcher's knife, to make the point, which I'll get to in a moment. The attitude that they gave her from her first scene in Context is for Kings was necessary for us to believe that she would take the action that led to her death, but this action was so ridiculous that no experienced, thoughtful Starfleet security officer would do it. With this kind of careless approach, an officer coming into contact with unknown environments and life forms would die very quickly. So I was not impressed with the writing at all when it came to Landry, start to finish, and this death scene. But this was a moment where the writers gave us a crystal clear contrast between what fans would call Star Trek and not Star Trek. But the actual scripting of the actions was very poor, as I mentioned. Nevertheless, the message was respect unknown life forms, learn about them, do not harm them. Don't rush in with your phasers, don't try to lop off their claws. Landry decides to use force without attempting to understand the tardigrade. She dies. Burnham takes the time to understand and communicate with the tardigrade. She finds the missing piece Discovery needs to save the colonists. That's very true to Gene Roddenberry's vision. That is Star Trek. So Landry served a purpose for the story. I just wish they had made her character more believable. And one other point that I would like to make while we're talking about Landry is that as a writer, you create characters to tell stories, and the characters serve the purpose of the story. It doesn't matter what color, gender, race, or species they are. This is Star Trek. The crew of the Discovery is very diverse, and Landry was just one of those crew. Her job put her in contact with the tardigrade. I've seen some people in social media complaining that the writers killed off a female character. And not only that, but they killed off a woman of color, as if it's part of some kind of plan by the writers to get rid of diversity. Well, they didn't kill the character to get rid of a woman of color. They killed the character because she was the security officer. Her job put her in this position with the tardigrade. She was blindly loyal to Lorca, and she made an insanely bad decision. She just happened to be a woman of color. If we have true equality, anyone can find themselves in any given situation and lose their life. That's how life works. And that's how a realistic story works. You don't build your story around protecting a ratio of color, gender, race, and species. That would be unrealistic. The writers just treated her like a character, which is what they should do. Okay, let's move on and talk about Klingons. There's been a lot of debate about the use of Klingon language. I have a degree in language and linguistics, and I'm mixed on it. I could make a case for why you should do it if my role were to campaign for its use as a creative decision. It makes the Klingons seem far more alien than they have in the past, and it helps show that the view from the other side is very different from ours. They see the world differently. One thing you learn if you speak multiple languages is that, to some extent, the language shapes the way you see the world, or vice versa. The way that a people see the world shapes their language. And seeing the Klingons speaking to each other in Klingon, it really highlights the fact that these are aliens seeing the world in a certain way, which may be very different than the way we see the world. So in that sense, I really like what they're doing. When all the aliens speak English, we naturally feel that they are more like us than unlike us. And I think that allows us to view the situation more as a black and white, good versus evil. And the real world is shades of gray. So again, in this sense, I really like it. The actors in this episode, Mary Sheffo and Javid Iqbal, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name properly. Mary plays Laurel, and Javid plays Vok. They did a really nice job of speaking Klingon in this episode, so kudos to them. I was really impressed with their ability to convey emotion, even while speaking a language that they don't really understand, and that's really difficult to do. They achieved a lot of that with their eyes. Laurel's eyes are particularly amazing, but they also did it with inflection and restraint and nuance in their voice, and that is difficult to do when you don't really understand the words. You've just memorized these words. I was really impressed. But I also feel that the all-Klingon dialogue is becoming tedious. It's creating a barrier between the viewer and the story. I hear this from so many people, and I feel that way myself a bit too. It disrupts the pacing, and unless you are staring at the screen, you have no idea what is going on. Now, the first time we watched the episode, we may be giving it our complete undivided attention, doing nothing else, and we're staring at the screen all the time and we're reading those subtitles. But as we go back and we rewatch over and over, sometimes we're finding the time to rewatch it as we're doing other things. And so having to look right at the screen for so much of the episode, it's really difficult. So as much as I applaud the creative vision and effort to create realism, even as someone who has studied languages since I was young, I think its value diminishes once you really start trying to tell a complex story involving these characters, which they very much did start doing in The Butcher's Knife. I'm not ready to say that they should start speaking English as in past Trek, but I do increasingly feel that this is an idea that seemed cool on paper, was cool to the viewer for the first few minutes, but may hurt the audience experience in the long run. We'll see, but props to everyone involved in translating, teaching, and speaking Klingon here. The attention to detail and the effort is really incredible, and as I've mentioned, I think on this show, but certainly I mentioned in my social media, if you're outside of the US watching on Netflix, as I am here in Japan, you can actually choose Klingon as a subtitle option, closed captioning, for the episodes, and the entire episode, including all the Starfleet dialogue, has been translated into Klingon. So they've gone all out on attention to detail. I'm just not completely sold on 15 episodes where half of the story is going to be spoken in Klingon and I have to read subtitles all the time. Okay, well anyway, that's all I have for the thoughts section. I do have more thoughts on the episode, but maybe I'll go into them some other time. I really liked this episode. I thought it was great. I felt that it was very Star Trek. It included some classic Trek story elements, such as having a time limit to save a colony, which may seem cheesy to some, but we've been watching our crews do it for half a century, so there's nothing new there, and that's what Star Trek does. And I'm really enjoying Discovery so far, even though I am a bit critical of it here and there. Now, let's move on to notes. There were fewer big Easter eggs in this one, fewer things with connections to screen and literature, but I'll mention a couple. Corvan 2. This is the home to the colony that Discovery must save, and it was mentioned in the TNG episode New Ground. In that episode, which involved Alexander going to school, the Enterprise D's primary school teacher, Ms. Kyle, has some gilvos. These are small creatures from Corvan 2 in a cage. And a gilvo also appears on Deep Space Nine in the Nagus. It's Zek's pet. So that's a tiny connection there with Corvan 2. And interestingly, in that TNG episode, New Ground, they are also trying to create a new way to fly.
We are creating a new way to fly.
In this case, by traveling on a wave that pushes the ship at warp speed without the need for warp drive. Another connection, more obvious, is the House of Kor. We all know Kor from Errand of Mercy. He may have even told you about his Mind Sifter, if you're lucky. And we later see him on Deep Space Nine in Blood Oath, The Sword of Kahless, and once more Unto the Breach. He also appears in the animated series episode The Time Trap. As for the House of Kor itself, by name, it is mentioned in Once More Unto the Breach, which is also where it ended, because Kor died with no heirs. It was previously led by his father, Rhinar, and in Discovery, the house is led by Cole. In the literary universe, the house is mentioned in the Excelsior novel Forged in Fire by Michael A. Martin and Andy Mangels, which is when the house is renamed Kor from House of Nagoj. That story also involves the albino, by the way, and I'm waiting to find out how Vok, as an albino, plays into the albino story, if he does at all. In Keith DeCandido's novella The Unhappy Ones, which I mentioned in Notes from the Edge, Episode 1, when I talked about the Black Fleet, we also find out that the House of Kor was once called the House of Marek, for reasons that tie into the Augments virus. Okay, those are the only two connections I'll talk about today. The other thing I want to talk about is the tardigrade, or what I call space water bear. As Burnham explains in the episode, this is an actual, real-life, microscopic creature that lives on Earth.
Your Ripper appears to share some natural traits with the tardigrade species. A docile creature that lives in the waters of the Earth. A microanimal. Capable of surviving extreme heat and sub-freezing temperatures.
Did you say microscopic?
In our case, somehow macroscopic.
How did it get on the Glen?
Although it isn't mentioned in the episode, water bear is one of the names given to this creature in real life. It's also called a moss piglet. The bear part of water bear is because when it moves, its trot resembles that of a bear. Only regular bears have 4 legs, not 8, at least on Earth. Like real bears, however, tardigrades do have sharp claws at the end of their limbs, just as Ripper on Discovery has sharp claws. That's a real thing. The water part is perhaps in part because tardigrades can be found in the ocean, but also because they require a thin layer of water for everything that they do. Unlike us, however, a tardigrade can all but dry up and then come back to life, even after long periods of time, once water is reintroduced. Although water bears are technically aquatic creatures, they can be found on land too, and scientists have found them all over the place, including under rocks in the Sinai Desert, on mountain tops, in mud volcanoes, and even in Antarctica. They are particularly common on lichens and mosses, so it makes sense what we're seeing on Discovery. One really interesting thing about tardigrades is that they can survive in almost any environment, no matter how extreme, which makes Ripper's presence aboard the Glen not so hard to swallow. I named a few different environments right there, but they can survive in temperatures ranging from 1 Kelvin, which is minus 458 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 272 Celsius, and that's almost absolute zero, all the way up to 420 degrees Kelvin or 300 degrees Fahrenheit or 150 degrees Celsius. In 2007, researchers with the European Space Agency placed tardigrades on the outside of a Photon M3 rocket and sent them into space. They orbited the Earth for 10 days, and when they were returned to Earth, 68% of them were still alive. So they survived the vacuum of space and the radiation in space. That project, by the way, is called Tardigrades in Space, or TARDIS. When in an extreme environment, a water bear can shed almost all of its water, to the point at which only about 3% remains. And then it can just stay in a state called desiccation. And it can remain in that state for more than a decade. And then, when water is reintroduced, it comes back to life. Think of it as letting a sponge virtually dry up, 3% water left, and then pop back into shape when you run water over it. Burnham mentioned that the Glen, because it didn't have a forest like Discovery has, would have needed to obtain and store large amounts of mushrooms, and they would need to rehydrate them. This is how Ripper could have come aboard unnoticed, probably at the normal microscopic size, been dormant for a long time, and then come back to life. How it became so large is a mystery, but I suspect we'll probably learn the answer to that in an upcoming episode. As I mentioned a moment ago, apart from the vacuum of space, tardigrades are also able to withstand the high levels of radiation that make space deadly to humans and most other life that we know. When in a state of desiccation, they produce high levels of antioxidants that neutralize the effects of the radiation. These little creatures are real things, and they are extremophiles in the extreme. So when fans say that the whole spore drive tardigrade storyline is ridiculous, that it is fantasy, not science fiction, and that it has no place in Star Trek, I say not so fast. While there are questions for sure, like how did Ripper become so large, and how does it move so rapidly without its layer of water? Because an actual tardigrade needs that layer of water, and when it's gone, they're pretty much dormant. But then again, maybe it does have a layer of water, and we haven't seen it yet in the dark lighting of these scenes. Maybe we'll find out. But despite these questions, this is a concept that you might find in hard SF, science fiction literature that places a strong emphasis on scientific accuracy. Basing an idea on real science doesn't mean you can't speculate and extrapolate. Werner Venge's A Fire Upon the Deep, a Hugo Award winner, widely considered to be one of the great SF novels. It's quite thick. Take you a little while to read it, but it's a really interesting story. That book includes a sentient plant species called the Scrode Riders. I imagine that if in the original series, The Next Generation, or any past Star Trek, we had been presented with the concept of a galaxy-spanning network of spores that can enable faster-than-light travel, and an unusual life form that could tap into it, we wouldn't be saying that it's ridiculous, fantasy, and doesn't belong in Star Trek. It's no more unusual than many of the other things that we've seen. It's not likely that such a thing actually exists in our real world, but it's not impossible. As Phineas and Ferb say, the only thing that's impossible is impossibility. But, this concept, it's right at home in science fiction's long history of pushing the boundaries of imagination and science. And personally, I think the tardigrade and the spore drive are fascinating. All right, so those are the notes from The Edge for Week 4 of Star Trek Discovery. Be sure to check out our other Discovery coverage throughout the week. Live from the Edge airs live at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific on Monday nights. It's broadcast on YouTube. You can actually participate. You can tweet questions or use the other chat to participate, and Brandy and Bruce will interact with you. And if you can't make it on Monday night, it comes out on Tuesday morning in the Edge feed as a podcast. Then on Wednesdays, we have a commentary track for you for the latest episode of Discovery. That's Tracks from the Edge. And we'll discuss your feedback on Postcards from the Edge on Thursday. Of course, on Fridays, you can catch our full analysis Trek-a-Film style on the Edge main show. And I'll be wrapping things up each week here on Notes from the Edge, usually on Saturdays. Sometimes it could be Sundays like this week, depending on what's happening with my work schedule. And that, as you've heard today, is a deep dive into links between Discovery and the broader franchise, and a few notes on some of the other concepts being introduced on the show. You'll find all of these in the main feed for The Edge and in the Trek-a-Film master feed. Now, we'd love to hear your thoughts on Discovery, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the things I talked about today on Notes from the Edge. The best place to do that is in the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook, where Amy Nelson will collect your feedback for Postcards from the Edge. And we do, as we do with all of our podcast episodes, a post for each episode of The Edge, including the sub-shows like this one. And you can discuss the things from that episode right there in the comments section. You can also find us on Twitter at TrekFM, or send us email using the contact form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Just choose to send to a show and choose the Edge. If you'd like to contact me personally, you can find me on Twitter. C Bryan Jones, the letter C and Bryan with a Y is my username. That's actually probably the best place to catch me. But you'll also find me in the Babel Conference, and C Bryan Jones is my username on Facebook and pretty much everywhere in social media. And I'd love to hear from you. If you want to catch me talking about other Star Trek topics, you can find me elsewhere on the network here on my main show called The Ready Room. I don't do it as often these days as I used to because of some medical issues that I've had over the past year, but there are 215 episodes up there for you, and episode 216 will be dropping very shortly after this episode of Notes from the Edge. Larry Nemechek and I hopped on mic again together to talk about what we've seen in Discovery through the first 3 episodes, and we sort of recap some of our thoughts from pre-launch in the Ready Room 215, and it was an interesting discussion. Check it out, see what you think. That's on The Ready Room, and that'll be episode 216. You can also find me on The Orb, our dedicated Deep Space Nine show, which I do with Matthew Rushing, and you can find my writing about Star Trek over on the official website at startrek.com. I'd like to take a moment before I go and thank our associate producers, Norman C. Lau, Tony Robinson, Lisa Slack, Tom Puleo, and Shoaib Mirza. Thank you so much, guys, for your support of The Edge. I really appreciate you helping us keep our Discovery coverage coming to everyone. We really couldn't do it without you guys, and if you'd like to join them and become an associate producer, or if you just want to support our shows in general, anywhere from $1 to whatever you want to contribute, you can do that through Patreon at patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM. We have all the details that you need up there, all the perks as well, including our special website, Patron Zone, and the Patrons Roundtable, where you can hop on and talk Star Trek with some of our hosts and fellow listeners. Well, that's all I have for you this time. Thank you so much for listening once again. I hope you enjoyed the show, and join me next time as we jot down more notes right on the paper's edge.